Hello, and welcome to a rather somber edition of What's Going On, a new segment in which myself, ST Wickett, and Bournbrook's editor, Michael Curzon, discuss the stories that don't quite make it to print. We both predicted this was going to happen. We both knew this was going to happen, yet the blow isn't softened in the slightest. Michael, what's going on?
Well, no newsflash for anybody who's been looking at any headlines of any newspaper for the past month now, which is sort of very telling of how we've found out about most COVID announcements over the past 15 months, which is that the seeds are planted about a month before an announcement. We all know it's going to happen. And then finally we're told as if it's groundbreaking news. So yes.
That has got to be government policy.
Oh, it must be. Well, I think Luke, as we were talking earlier, Luke Perry said that partly it may be a way of gauging public support or lack thereof, and I think that could be an element of it.
Because they backtracked significantly on vaccine passports when that kind of got negative around initially.
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. Although it's strange with this one because from what I've been reading, a lot of the top figures, by which I mean all of the top figures, the top four, Boris, Sunak, Hancock, and I think it might be Gove actually the fourth. We're all in favour of extending lockdown. So this wasn't like it was, well, we've got to try and persuade the last one or even two. Therefore, we're really not sure yet. All four have been in favour of this from the moment it was first hinted at. So yeah, I don't think we actually said it there, but Boris Johnson has just announced earlier today that lockdown will be extended by 4 weeks. And I think the main reason really, because as we just said, this isn't news. We all knew this was going to happen. But the main reason I wanted to do a recording now was, as he said in the introduction, this is a segment in which we discuss the stories that don't make it to print. And that doesn't only mean Bournbrook print. That means that sort of the national media print. And I think personally, the most important point, possibly the most important 2 or 3 points of the press conference, were completely omitted by the media reporting of the matter, largely because Boris Johnson's initial speech, which is kind of what the media focuses on before questions come in, first from the public for whatever reason, and then from so-called journalists. Within that time, nothing really was said other than what we already knew. Lockdowns to be extended. We're going to save thousands of lives. We're going to increase the vaccine rollout. La da da. We knew that already. That sort of was confirmed before Boris even opened his mouth. What was more interesting and came later, and it came in response to questions, especially in response to Laura Kuenssberg's question, but not that she asked on anything related to this. It just appeared in Boris's mind clearly that this was a reasonable time to mention this fact. Is that one, the first important point, we were told there's going to be a sort of a breakaway clause if the data is good in 2 weeks' time rather than the full 4. So that's on July 5th. Then we could get out of this. Now, Boris mentioned this in the initial 4 minutes and said, we might be able to break out of this. You know, the whole data, not date stick, which I imagine you're going to comment on here, Sam.
The data is good. 3 people died today. 3.
Exactly. So we know it's nonsense already. But even Boris knows that. Boris knows that this whole promise of a 2-week getaway clause, if everything looks good, is tosh. In his words, quote, we must wait another 4 weeks, or maybe as little as 2 weeks. But let's be realistic. It's probably more likely to be 4 weeks. That's him speaking. That's not even us. And people say that we're crazy when we say they're not actually following the data because regardless, they're going to carry on with this thing and that they want longer and longer lockdowns. He's admitted this himself, that it's unrealistic to even think the government could imagine ending this extended lockdown after a mere 2 weeks of business closure and misery. That's still not enough. So the second, well, you go first before I go on to the second point.
There isn't just the economic backlash of this. It's also, it's like being so close to the end of a race and then suddenly the finish line just darts, 50 yards down. It's just so demoralizing.
Yeah. And like people make it to the end of the race.
If I'm gonna put on my really cynical hat here, I'm gonna say this whole thing is just a exhibition of mental abuse. For since what, March now, February, March, we've been told that this is our roadmap. By June 21st, we'll be happy and free, able to frolic in the fields, whatever, right? And as soon as it started to look like it was actually going to happen, the numbers were plummeting, right? We had a day with 1 death, a day with 0 deaths. And then suddenly it started creeping into the press that although people aren't dying, although it seems that the vaccine is doing its job in terms of reducing fatalities of the vulnerable, which is what really matters. I mean, the rest of us, I mean, you and I could catch this tomorrow and we'd be fine.
We probably wouldn't even know that we had it.
Wouldn't even know we
tested.
that. I had the virus during the first wave, and I didn't. It felt like it was for one morning. I had basically a bad hangover.
Right.
And after that, nothing. Right. Look at the data. We're 3 people died today. Right. I haven't seen a double-digit death toll in the last 2 weeks. We're operating.
Just very quickly on that. The ONS admitted that within these daily death figures, a lot of the numbers aren't actual deaths primarily from COVID. So 40% of deaths in the last few months, that is the most recent 103 deaths as of last week, 40% of those were people who happened to have COVID, but didn't die from COVID. It wasn't the primary cause of death on the death certificate, yet it was still put as a COVID death. It's still what Chris Whitty stood there when saying, next graph, please, that was the cause of this extension of lockdown. But even the government's own providers of figures say this is nonsense. This isn't a COVID death. And only 3 days ago were NHS hospitals told in their data to differentiate between people who had COVID in hospital but were being treated for something else and people who had COVID and were actually ill from it. Only 2 days ago, after 15 months, did they actually bother to differentiate between people who had the COVID and were ill and those who weren't. It's pathetic. It's as if they want this to carry on because the most blatant things, such as measuring between someone who has COVID and gets hit by a bus and someone who actually dies from COVID, is only being done now. Why, after all this time?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're operating far below SAGE predictions, right? SAGE, the modeling, which has forced the PM's hand, supposedly. I mean, I would be surprised if this is all he's doing, but into 3 lockdowns already, right? Which is SAGE's predictive modeling. We're operating so far below that, right? We are, I think, per capita, probably the most vaccinated country in the world.
Very high up there.
You have to ask yourself, so the justification that they've given is that we need more time to vaccinate more people. Well, if the vulnerable are vaccinated and people aren't dying, then what good is any of this going to do?
Yeah, well, on that, so one thing very quickly on the figures, I noticed this straight away in Boris's first speech, and please listen back and don't take my word for it. Listen to it and ascertain this for yourself. We were told about all the figures and where we were at the moment, but not once was an actual figure stated. It was all percentages. We've seen a 50% increase in deaths, a 20% increase in deaths, a 100% increase in deaths. Well, when you're starting from single figures, a 100% increase in deaths actually isn't the end of the world, I'm afraid to say. And when cases were so low as they were at one stage, having a X percentage increase of deaths doesn't really mean very much. You need to look at the actual raw figures. But as I say, in Boris's speech I'm talking about, that simply wasn't done. And on the second point, so you just said if with the vulnerable vaccinated, surely we should be safe from it. But this actually was said in Boris's initial speech, which was a really interesting point, which is essentially the government doubting the virus, which it tells everybody to get. Again, a quote: "A proportion of the elderly and vulnerable may still succumb to the virus, even if they've had 2 jabs." So that really, as you said, the point of extending lockdown was getting more people vaccinated, and that's what the point is now, to save thousands of lives, as they say. But what's to stop them at the end of 4 weeks to say this again? All right, now 90% of you have been vaccinated, but as I said in the last conference, quote, "A portion of elderly and vulnerable may still succumb to the virus. Therefore, we need to extend it even longer just to be sure that that's not the case."
Bear in mind, they'll even tell you that the vaccine doesn't protect you from getting the virus, right? It just reduces the risk of death. So again, if I can still get it, if I can still pass it on, and if the person who's supposedly protected can still die, then what we have is the basis for this to go on forever.
Yes.
Right? And that's something that Chris Whitty said. He said, COVID will continue to kill people for the rest of our lives. So if you take that, and you take the need to save lives for this one reason, not any other reason, but for this one reason, what you have there is a logical circle, right, which goes round and round and round and round, and it will never end.
No, it is complete tosh, as you say, and what we're told is that the government doesn't believe in a zero COVID strategy. So, as you said, Chris Whitty says we're going to have to carry on living with this, and whilst we want to be cautious with the roadmap, it's going to be irreversible because we're going to accept that people will carry on dying with COVID. But as you said, 3 deaths today. Recently, 1 death in the whole United Kingdom, that is. So 3 countries with 0 deaths. We've had that on a number of occasions. Not too long ago, 0 deaths. Fine, we have an increase in cases at the moment, but and even hospitalizations, but mainly of people who are younger, who have the virus for a short time, don't get that ill, and in the end don't die, which is why number of deaths are still very low. So we're being told we're not taking a zero COVID approach, and at the same time not accepting that 1 or 2 or 3 people can die of COVID a day, which sounds to me near enough like a zero COVID approach.
That's about the same number of people who die falling down the stairs every day.
I can well imagine, exactly. And it's and what's always ignored. So we're told there's been X number of COVID deaths today. Well, how many have died from cancer? Possibly because, or definitely because, in many cases, of being referred too late for treatment to have a good enough impact. Hundreds, most days, but none of that is reported.
Or even the elephant in the room: how many people have killed themselves because they can't go on like this?
Precisely, terribly high figures. And the question is, which is the second point I'd like to mention from the briefing, again, not said in the initial speech, despite it being so crucial, but said in response to a question from Laura Kuenssberg, though not actually answering that question, just a general point, which it seemed Boris felt the need he had to say at some point, but not when most people were listening, which is about how long this will last for. So it says, by the 19th of July, we should have created, quote, a wall of immunity against the virus. So most people by that point, 75% they want of adults will be vaccinated against COVID. But here's the really important point, and I quote, I'm confident that we will be able to go forward with the full opening at that date, that is. That, of course, doesn't exclude the possibility that there is some new variant that is far more dangerous, that kills people in a way that we currently cannot foresee or understand. That's obviously the case. Now, he says that's obviously the case as if that's a justification for leaving it out of the initial speech. But that, for me, is the crux of this whole briefing tonight. July 19th is the new date for the end of lockdown. That is, unless we have another new variant, which, as he says, is more dangerous, far more dangerous, kills people in a way we currently cannot understand. And that, I think, is the real crux of this whole briefing. July 19th is the end date. Total nonsense. It's as nonsensical as was the 3 weeks to flatten the curve, as was the June 21st roadmap date, and as is the July 5th breakout clause. I'm afraid that I genuinely believe July 19th will not spell the end of this lockdown.
No, of course it won't. Of course it won't.
And we have an article, which by the time you're listening to this will be on the website, by Luke Perry on Wednesday, which is an important read in my opinion. He starts with a hilarious line, 15 months on from 3 weeks to save the NHS, which again, you have to read these things and think, do I laugh or do I cry? And at this current moment, I'm laughing, but that may change quite soon, perhaps when we're not recording. But he says, we've been informed that this is the final push. What folly. If anyone still has any ounce of trust in our political overlords, may I remind them that the furlough scheme, the perfect predictor for any future lockdown, has been extended until September. So July 19th, I'm not so sure. As he argues, the precedent has now been set. This is here for good. And we heard, remember, Suzanne Michie, the communist, Stalin's nanny, and top leading member of SAGE for a conservative government, said that masks and all that should last forever, but more importantly, that some restrictions, not even including masks, but working from home and working more locally in offices such like that, these could be adopted for future problems like new viruses, like climate change. An example that she gave in an article you can read on Lockdown Skeptics by myself, this will be repurposed for future crises, in their words, forever and ever and ever, until, that is, we should move on to this, until enough people stand up and say no. And I've got to say, I've been horrendously unimpressed by GB News at the beginning. A lot of it very unprofessional, some young, untalented, boring presenters who can't string a sentence out and who are embarrassing next to some of the heavyweights in political journalism who actually have done a very good job. And I'm surprised they're sat next to some of these figures. But regardless, they have covered the protest taking place outside Downing Street today, massive protest, people saying, no, we are not carrying on until July 19th. This is stopping now, no matter what you say. And we need to have more of that. More people saying, I don't care what you say. I'm living my life as normal. And the more people who report on that, cover it, let people know that they're not alone and that other people feel this way, the better.
Become ungovernable.
Quite. And it's horrible to have to say that, really. I mean, it's one of the eternal struggles within conservatism is the sort of ideal life of a conservative is one person living with a family, with a small community in the sticks, you know, self-reliant and all that, not listening to the government. But at the same time, we are firm on law and order, and there's certain things we don't want people to do, like drug usage is a heavy question, and enforcement of other important laws. But I think on the question of lockdown, we have to go to the former and say, actually, because of the impact this has on our lives, which for younger people is negligible, that this should be left up to us to make our own informed decisions and not to be told by a prime minister whether or not we can hug people.
And I think that is what's going on.
It is indeed. Thank you.
Quite a long one this time round. I think we both had a lot of steam to blow off.
Yeah, well, we could have told you at the beginning it would last 3 minutes just to that was too extended.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, in the never-ending merry-go-round of betrayal and arguable treason, I'm sure there'll be plenty more going on for us to discuss in the future. For now, from Michael and myself, thank you for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Cheers.